The old Ford rumbled along the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still summer air, like ghosts refusing to move on. I leaned out the passenger window, the dry heat brushing against my face, and scanned the endless wall of pine trees. It felt like the forest had swallowed us whole hours ago, leaving nothing behind but the sound of tires crunching gravel and the low hum of static from the radio. "You sure this is the right way, Cole?" Jess asked from the back seat. Her voice was casual, but I caught the edge of unease she tried to hide. Cole, who was driving, didn't answer right away. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, and his eyes darted to the map spread across the dashboard. "It's the right way," he muttered. "It's supposed to feel like this." Remote, that was the whole point of this trip. To escape. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no civilization for miles. Just us and Lake Shadow, a name whispered among hiking forums as the kind of place you didn't just find. It found you. "Relax, Jess," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "This is exactly what we wanted, right?" A little peace and quiet. Jess didn't respond, but I saw her shift in her seat, glancing nervously at the towering trees. The sun dipped lower, its light slicing through the branches like golden knives. By the time we reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, the world had turned an eerie shade of orange. Cole killed the engine, and the sudden silence pressed down on us like a weight. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs and taking in the view. The lake was a sheet of glass, reflecting the darkening sky. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it. "All right, let's get started," Cole said, popping the trunk. I glanced back at the road, now barely visible through the trees. It hit me then. We were completely alone. By the time we'd pitched the tents and built a small fire, the last streaks of daylight had bled away, leaving the campsite wrapped in shadows. The lake, calm and inviting earlier, now seemed like a black mirror. Every ripple on its surface felt deliberate, like something unseen moving just beneath. Cole was the first to break the silence. "This place is perfect," he said, leaning back against a log and cracking open a beer. His usual cocky grin was in place, but it felt forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. "Perfect for what?" Jess muttered, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. She'd been jumpy ever since we arrived, her eyes darting toward the tree line every few minutes. "For disconnecting," Cole replied. "For resetting. Isn't that why we came here?" Jess didn't answer, and I couldn't blame her. Something about this place gnawed at the edges of my mind, too. It wasn't just the isolation. I'd camped in remote spots before. This was different, like the forest itself was watching. "I think it's peaceful," I said, trying to ease the tension. "We've all been wound so tight lately. Maybe we just need to." Adjust, Jess snorted. "To what exactly?" "Being in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help." Cole rolled his eyes. "You're such a buzzkill, Jess." "Okay, stop," I said, raising a hand. "Let's not spend the whole trip arguing. Can we just enjoy this for 5 minutes?" Cole muttered something under his breath, but Jess fell silent, staring into the flames. The firelight danced across their faces, revealing more than I think any of us intended. Cole's bravado was paper thin, barely hiding the stress that had been building in him for months. Jess, usually the tough one, looked small and vulnerable, her fingers twitching against her knees. And me? I wasn't much better. The truth was, this trip wasn't just about getting away. It was about finding something. Peace, maybe. Closure. Or just a reason to keep moving forward. "Did you guys hear that?" Jess whispered suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. We all froze, ears straining. "Hear what?" Cole asked, his voice lower now. Jess pointed toward the tree line. I don't know. Like footsteps. The forest was silent. Too silent. Probably just an animal, I said, though my chest felt tight. Jess didn't look convinced, but she didn't push it. Still, as the hours dragged on, her unease spread like a virus. Even Cole stopped cracking jokes, his eyes flicking toward the trees more often than I liked. By the time we turned in for the night, the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. It started around midnight. I just drifted off in my tent when a noise yanked me back to consciousness. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic for that. It was a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood. Cole, I called out, my voice low but sharp. No response. I unzipped the tent slowly, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting the campsite in weak, flickering light. Cole's tent was zipped shut, and Jess's was quiet. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I heard it again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. I swung the flashlight toward the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. The beam caught the glint of something, a reflection, maybe eyes, but it was gone before I could focus on it. Jess, I hissed, crawling over to her tent. I shook it lightly. Wake up, she groaned, pulling the zipper down just enough to poke her head out. What? Do you hear that? Jess rubbed her eyes, irritated, but then the sound came again, louder now. Her face paled, and she scrambled out of the tent, clutching her own flashlight. What the hell is that? She whispered. I don't know. By now, Cole had woken up too, his face groggy but alert as he stepped into the clearing. What's going on? Jess turned to him, her voice trembling. There's something out there, Cole snorted. It's probably a raccoon or a deer. You guys are acting like kids, but even as he said it, his eyes darted to the tree line and his bravado faltered. Let's just check it out, I said, more to calm myself than anything else. We moved together, flashlights sweeping the area in shaky arcs. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, a low, guttural noise broke through the stillness, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. We froze. What the hell was that? Jess whispered, her voice cracking. Cole didn't answer. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely scared. The next day, the tension was unbearable. We tried to brush off the incident, chalking it up to wild animals or our overactive imaginations, but something had shifted. The easy camaraderie we'd shared the night before felt like a distant memory. Jess was quieter than usual, her eyes constantly scanning the forest, and Cole had taken to pacing around the campsite, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. I'm going to check out the trail, Cole said abruptly after breakfast, breaking the silence. Maybe get a better look at this place. You two stay here. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't want to stay in this eerie, suffocating campsite, but I also didn't want to wander off alone into the woods with that thing out there. Jess didn't even look up, just muttered something under her breath, too distracted by the strange, sour taste in the air. I watched Cole disappear into the trees, his figure swallowed by the thick underbrush. Then I turned to Jess, who was standing by the fire pit, her eyes blank. You okay? I asked, my voice cautious. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared into the dying embers, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. Finally, she spoke, almost to herself. You don't believe me, do you? Believe what? I asked, though I already had an idea. The things I've been seeing. The noises. It's not just in my head, I hesitated. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I couldn't lie either. I don't know, Jess. It's just so damn strange. Her voice dropped, becoming a whisper. You don't get it. I've been here before. I blinked, confused. What? This place? She said, her words tumbling out in a rush. When I was younger, I came here with my family, and there were stories about things that happened in these woods. People who went missing, people who disappeared. My stomach churned. What kind of stories? I don't know. My parents never talked about it, but I remember feeling it something wrong in the air, something watching us. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just a random spot. Jess hadn't been the one to suggest this place. It had been Cole. I glanced at the empty space where he'd gone, suddenly wondering if there was more to his story than he'd let on. Was he hiding something? Just then, the sound of a branch snapping underfoot echoed from the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to Jess. Cole's back already? I asked. She shook her head. No, that's not him. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, no matter where we went in the woods. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on us, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should, even though it was midday. Jess was on edge, her eyes darting around, and I was no better off. We tried to keep busy, but every little noise made us jump. It was around late afternoon when things took a turn. I heard the crunching of leaves before I saw him. At first, I thought it was Cole, but when the figure emerged from the trees, I froze. It wasn't him. The man who stepped into the clearing looked wrong. His skin was pale, too pale, like it hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and they were fixed on us with an unsettling intensity. He didn't say anything, just stared. I felt my pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Jess was the first to speak. Who are you? She asked, her voice sharp but shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Get away from us, I said, my voice cracking. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The man's mouth twitched just slightly, as though he was fighting a smile. He took another step closer, and that's when I saw it. On the side of his neck, just barely visible beneath his shirt, was a mark. A dark, angry bruise in the shape of a handprint. My heart skipped a beat. I'd seen it before. Not here, but somewhere in my past, somewhere I couldn't place. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind me. Hey, what the hell are you doing? It was Cole. He was back just in time to see the man turn his head toward him, his eyes narrowing. The stranger didn't say anything, but his gaze was filled with something almost hungry. I said, "Who the hell are you?" Cole repeated, his voice louder now. But the man didn't answer. He just turned on his heel and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the trees as suddenly as he had appeared. What the hell was that? Cole muttered, his eyes scanning the woods. I don't know, I whispered, but I think we need to get out of here. Now, we didn't move for a long time. The forest was unnervingly silent, as though it had swallowed up the strange man and the sounds of our voices. I kept waiting for him to reappear, for that eerie figure to step back into the clearing, but he never did. The air felt wrong, thick with something unspeakable, and I couldn't shake the image of that handprint on his neck. Cole was pacing, running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself. What the hell was that? Who the hell was that? Jess stood frozen, staring in the direction the man had gone, her face pale. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. I told you. Something's wrong with this place. It's not just the woods. It's cursed, cursed. I couldn't help but scoff. But even as I said it, I knew I was just grasping at straws. There was something to her words, something I couldn't ignore. That guy, he was like a ghost. Not real. Cole shot me a look, as though he was about to argue, but then his eyes darted back toward the woods. No, this is bigger than that. Something's been watching us. And it's not just the man. I felt it then, an overwhelming sense of dread creeping in. It wasn't just our imagination anymore. Something in the air had changed. We weren't just being paranoid. This wasn't just a bad camping trip. I turned to Jess, my voice desperate. We need to leave. Now. She shook her head slowly, eyes wide with fear. We can't. It's too late for that. We all stood there, frozen, as the reality of our situation sank in. The woods were no longer just a backdrop. They were part of this part of whatever was hunting us. We should have left. I know that now, but at the time, we didn't. Jess's words hung in the air, heavy and damning. It's too late for that. But I still thought we could fight it, whatever it was. The three of us sat around the campfire that night, more out of habit than comfort, too afraid to sleep and too anxious to talk. Every snap of a twig or rustling of leaves sent our hearts racing. Cole, the loudest of us before, had gone quiet. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and nerves. It was as though he knew deep down that this wasn't just some weird encounter. There was something darker happening. I could see it in his eyes. I'm not staying here, I finally said, breaking the silence. My voice was hoarse, and my mind was racing. I wanted to go, to get in the car and drive until the woods were a distant memory. But the thought of driving through the dark, with what had been watching us in the rearview mirror, was just as terrifying. Jess spoke then, in a voice that cracked under the weight of everything. We have to face it. We can't run anymore. Her words shook me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about confronting whatever it was that had taken root in these woods. It wasn't going to let us go. Not without a fight. We face it together, I said, more to myself than to them. The weight of my own words hit me then, and I realized I wasn't just trying to convince Jess or Cole. I was trying to convince myself that we had a chance. It was time to find out what was really hunting us and why. We couldn't stay around the campfire any longer. The darkness outside felt alive, as though it were pressing in, wrapping its fingers around the tent, suffocating us. Jess insisted on going back into the woods. She'd found something, a clue, something she couldn't explain, but it had to be connected. I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to, but by then, we didn't have the luxury of hesitation. We grabbed flashlights and made our way into the forest. The trees loomed like silent witnesses to our trespass, and every step was a whisper on the wind, sending chills down my spine. I could hear Cole's breath beside me, shallow and quick. He was nervous. Jess led the way, her eyes wild with determination, though I could tell she was just as scared as we were. Then we heard it. A voice. Barely a whisper like the wind, but unmistakable. Turn back. It came from somewhere behind us, distant but clear. We all froze. Who's there? I called out, my voice too loud in the dead silence. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my chest. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. No one. The voice came again, closer this time. Turn back, and then it hit us, an overwhelming presence. Cold. Suffocating. Like a weight that pressed down on our chests, stealing the breath from our lungs. I turned around, panic rising in my throat, but nothing was there. Yet the feeling lingered. Something was there, watching us, waiting. Then Jess screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of rage, of something primal. She charged forward, breaking through the trees, the flashlight swinging wildly in her hand. Cole and I were frozen, but we followed her, desperate to catch up. And then we saw it. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in that clearing. It could have been seconds or hours. Time doesn't make sense in places like this. But when I finally found the strength to move, the weight of what we saw crushed me. Jess was standing in the center of the clearing, her face blank, her eyes wide, as if she wasn't really there anymore. The flashlight had fallen to the ground, its beam casting erratic shadows on the trees. In front of her, surrounding her were shapes. Tall, hunched forms that seemed to melt into the darkness. They were not quite human, not quite anything. The voice came again, and this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud and hollow, as if coming from everywhere. You should have stayed away. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But something held me there, an invisible force pressing me into the ground, freezing my feet to the earth. Cole was beside me, his hand gripping my arm with a vice-like intensity. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. We could only watch as Jess moved toward them, her movements jerky, unnatural, as though she were being pulled forward by strings. "Jess," I screamed, but she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. The last thing I remember is seeing her face, her eyes, wide and vacant, and then the things that were around her. They didn't need to touch her. She just disappeared. 1 second, she was there, and the next, nothing. Cole and I ran, no longer worried about the light or sound. We just ran. But I know deep down, it didn't matter. There was no escape. There never had been. I tried to leave. I tried to run and forget what happened in those woods, but there's no forgetting it. Not really. I can still see Jess's face, her eyes, hollow, empty, like she was already gone before she disappeared. Cole didn't make it out. I think he died that night, even though his body was never found. Maybe it was the terror. Maybe it was the thing that had been waiting in the woods all this time. Whatever it was, it got to him too. It's just me now, sitting in a room somewhere far from that cursed place, trying to pretend I'm safe. I keep thinking about the voice, the thing that told us to leave, should have stayed away. I've read about it since, though it's not something that people talk about openly. I've seen the threads online, others like us, who heard the same voice, felt the same chill. It wasn't just us. It's never just us. I don't sleep much anymore. When I do, I wake up gasping, eyes wide, expecting to see them standing in the shadows, watching. I wish I could say it was over, but deep down, I know it's not. I'm still running.